Hello, everyone. This is the Making Photos live podcast, and I am your host, Todd Klassy. I'm glad to have everybody here with us tonight, which isn't going to be too many because we're just starting this shindig. This is the second podcast I've done in as many weeks. Every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. my time, Mountain Time, 9 p.m. Eastern. I'll broadcast live as I talk about photography, edit some photos, and do a few other things that we're going to start adding here starting next week. My new Logitech webcam is in, but I'm not going to turn it on until next week. I've got my backdrop I'm working on, moving around some furniture in my office so I can come up with a nice backdrop. We'll tune that in next week. I'm sure none of you are going to be anxiously waiting for that anyhow, but I thought I'd fill you in on that. Tonight, I'm editing some photos. I'll see how far I get. I've got two that I can work on. These are old grain elevators. They're located in Hobson, Montana. For those of you that live outside the United States or east of the Mississippi, or even, I guess, in California and the West Coast, you might be a little more unfamiliar with these structures, especially if you live in an urban area. Grain elevators are kind of dying out, at least this style. A lot of them in the West were built 100 and some years ago. They were located along train tracks that no longer exist anymore, that are no longer functioning. It was a way for farmers and growers to bring their grain to market. They would bring their grain to the elevator would buy it. They would do exactly what their description is. They would elevate the grain high so they could be dumped into a waiting hopper or a railroad wagon that would take it off to market. And unfortunately, these majestic old aging buildings are starting to go away. In fact, in the last 7 years, I know of at least 12 that have been torn down in the state of Montana, which is unfortunate. It's sad because photographers love them, and they're frankly an attraction for tourists, especially in a part of the state and a part of the country that doesn't see a lot of people. These particular ones were on land that was owned by BNSF Railroad, and starting about a year and a half ago, BNSF told the people of Hobson, and that's what you don't see off screen here. There's a small town of about 800 people, camera left, just off the side of these two grain elevators, and they told them that they were going to tear them down, and there's a reason for it. Some people were mad at BNSF Railroad, but one of the reasons is that, I mean, they're a danger. They're starting to fall apart, they're starting to fall down. Kids go inside, they mess around, and they can get hurt, and there's a huge liability to BNSF. So, they're starting to tear these down. Well, the good people of Hobson, Montana banded together and raised some money so that they could try to save these, and they were successful. They were able to buy the lease on the land that BNSF owned, and they basically bought these grain elevators. And now they're in their process of trying to raise another $30,000 so they can add new roofs to these. I mean, that's one of the biggest things. Having a poor roof obviously contributes greatly to a building's demise. So they're trying to replace the roofs, and they're trying to fix the exterior. These are grain elevators that I started photographing long before the issue about them coming down happened. And it just so happened to be a coincidence that I happen to have a lot of photos of them. I'm still editing photos from over the years of these grain elevators. They're particularly interesting because they're painted red. A lot of grain elevators are just basically gray or steel, or have a pretty blasé exterior, but these stick out. They have a fading paint, but they still stick out compared to the average grain elevator. So it was kind of neat to go out and photograph them. So I'm going to start editing this photo in particular, and then, as you know, I like to talk about things that are going on in the world of photography. One of the things I was going to talk about tonight was I've been reading a couple articles. I like to read Psychology Today and a few other old magazines. And one of the magazines, a couple of articles over the last year have popped up talking about the psychology of photography and how social media and selfies and how the way we use cameras today is evolving. And so I thought that would be a good dovetail into kind of a new feature that I'm going to start working on here on the podcast that hopefully will make things a little more interesting as time goes by. But we'll see. So anyhow, I don't know if you're aware of this, but it was estimated last year that approximately 1.3 trillion photos were taken across the universe, I guess, and that would be the planet Earth. And that's pretty remarkable if you think about it. The funny part about that is, and it's really no joke, most of them stay on a person's camera in their memory card or on their cell phone on their memory card. Most of them never even see the light of day. That's why people like me, professional photographers, frankly, still have a job because there's probably a few decent ones out there. I mean, the old adage, and even a blind squirrel can find an acorn, exists. And so, lucky for me, most of these photographs never seen the light of day. But they're out there, and it used to be a process. Years ago when people used film. For those of you that are under age of 30, you might even forget what those days are like. And because there was a process in making photos, and frankly, because you didn't have the ability to make thousands of photographs in one day like you do now because of memory cards and the digital technology. That process changed the way people viewed the scenes that they were photographing. I mean, if you think about how film was used, you would take a photograph, then the process involved developing the film, then it was making a print. I mean, it wasn't like instantaneous. I mean, unless you had a Polaroid, even that was a process. You would have to send your camera, your film off to have the film developed, and then you'd have to have prints made, and that was a completely separate process. And then you had to share them the old-fashioned way. I mean, you stuck them in an album or you hung them on a wall. And nowadays, people share photos by attaching them to an email or sharing them on Facebook or things like that. And so they become, I guess the best word I'm thinking of, they become kind of a commodity. Commodities are things like, when you go to a grocery store and you find like milk. I mean, it's a very common thing. And that's kind of how photographs have become, and so cell phones have changed all that. In 2005, when I first got into photography, every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there was, they were I think most people are interested in photography in some ways, and so everybody had to go out and go buy a digital SLR camera because they thought that was the ticket to making great photos. Little did they realize that cameras contribute very little to the making of a great photograph. It's still has a lot to do with the photographer. It has a lot to do with what lenses you use, how you process them. There's a lot more than just pressing a button. But cell phones really came into their being here in the last 5 years, and they really kind of changed all. And it's changing how we see the world. I mean, just because there are so many photographs out there, and unlike video, cell phones can be very selective over what they photograph. Cell phones or any camera, you can leave out the bad things. You can, and that's changed even in the world of making selfies. There's still a process involved when you use a cell phone, but the process has changed. When I go out and make photos now, I mean, I remember, what it used to cost to buy, a roll of like 36 exposure film. It wasn't cheap. And then you had to pay to have the film developed. And that wasn't, exactly cheap. Well, hell, I'll go on a photo shoot now, where I'm, photographing an event that might last 4 hours, and I'll shoot 2,000 to 3,000 photographs. So, I mean, that has changed the process of, taking photos there alone. But there are applications out there, thanks to the world of, I don't know, vanity. Is that the word to use? Where you have all these millennials that are out making selfies, and you know they they want to look better to the world. Hey, Kathy, they want to look better to the world. And hi, Terry. They want to look better to their friends, and who can blame them? I mean, I can't blame anyone for that. Um, but it's again selective. It's not necessarily reality. It's not 100% truth. Well, they've created these apps now that completely make your images look better. Well, one of them, I guess they're called apps now. When I grew up, it was called software. But here's one that I'm using right now. It's called Photoshop. It allows me to go in and touch it up and take out things that are obstruct the person's view from what what we're viewing, and it changes the view slightly from what was actually recorded when we were out there. Well, that's really happening in the world of selfies. I mean, you can go buy apps now that make your, remove skin blemishes. They increase or decrease the size of your nose. They improve, your smile. Believe it or not, they can color your hair. They can make your face thinner. They can improve the lighting. I mean, any number of things. Basically, anything I can do in Photoshop, you can now do with an add-on app to your cell phone and make your cell phone better. And again, that's I think that's why when these people deal with these dating apps, they go out and they see a picture of someone, and then they all of a sudden they show up and you're like, wait a minute, this isn't the picture I saw online. So it's created some problems in that regard, I guess. But that's kind of the name of the beast. That goes with the territory. I mean, there's a saying in photography that any photo that needs to be colorized is probably a bad photo. And Instagram is famous for adding filters to photographs, and making you colorize a photo. And there was a time when all the amateur photographers out there, and even the professional ones, they were like, "Oh, I gotta add, make this colorized." Well, that might work for you, but in the world of professional photography, that doesn't work for a client. In other words, I've never had a client buy a photograph that was colorized. They don't do it. I mean, that's, you don't see colorized photos, for example, with a filter in magazines. It just doesn't happen that way. So, I mean, for what I do, that's, you just can't do that. So, and these have all changed, selfies. But why all of these apps need to change how we look? Well, it's kind of the millennial approach to improving how one looks. I mean, I don't know if millennials are any more vain than my generation was. Probably not. But if they have the tools, I mean, if we had the tools, my generation, available to us at the time when we snapped a Polaroid picture, would we have done the same thing? Probably. So I can't blame. I like to blame the millennials for a lot of things, but that's not one I guess I'm prepared to blame them for. Not outright, at least. But it still is different. Selfies, might also make us, these articles talked about, more self-critical, which they were talking about in the articles that can lead to things like depression. You go onto Facebook, and I think Facebook contributes a lot to this too. You go onto places like Facebook, and you see these people you graduated from high school from, and they're talking about stuff that's happening in their lives. And of course, everybody amps that stuff out. I mean, if you're on YouTube and you belong to any social community on YouTube or any social media stuff, you find out that people tend to exaggerate their lives for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure. It used to be, where I came from, when you grew up in the country, you just, talking about the cows getting out was enough of a story to entertain you for the day or even the week, depending on what happened. But now it's like you have to talk about climbing to the top of Kilimanjaro. You have to experience this, you have to experience that. You got to tell everybody what you ate that day and how wonderful it was, when in reality you probably had SpaghettiOs for the last week. I mean, it's just real interesting how that has all changed, and the psychology that goes into how selfies and Facebook have contributed to that. I think the cell phone and the selfie has made us vain. I think that the reason why people seek out relationships online as opposed to in person is that, well, maybe they don't look like how they look in person, and the internet has kind of taught us, I think, to be a little vain, and to not really appreciate who we are or what we look like. I'm reminded of an episode of Seinfeld from, I don't know how long ago it was, but Seinfeld had an episode once, and I'm going to get the statistics wrong, so I apologize in advance. But he said in one of the episodes that, basically, 80% of the people in the world are very average looking. And then maybe 10%, or I don't know what he said, maybe 5 or 10% were ugly. And maybe 5 or 10% were stunningly attractive. And I really think that's kind of right. And the weird part about it is, frankly, that, in the world of photography, we're taught to photograph things that are extreme. In other words, things that are very tall make a good photograph. Things that are very short make a good photograph. Things that are big make a good photograph. Things that are very small, very young, very old, extremes. Any extremes can make a very good photograph. And it's unfortunate that, even the people who are consider themselves unattractive are, worried about what they look like. Well, I mean, I get that. I really honestly do. But honestly, there are a lot of famous people that if you truly are unattractive, and you probably are not, I got news for you. There's a whole group of people out there who have made a living on being unattractive. So, and as they say, every pot has a lid. So I wouldn't worry about too much what other people think. And unfortunately, selfies kind of contribute. I think, unfortunately, what most people don't realize is that the size, your camera changes how you look. I mean, the average person doesn't realize this. They don't realize that the size of a sensor and the focal length and the angle at which you hold a camera can radically change how you look. And people don't realize that. It's one reason why they teach you when you take selfies that you should hold the camera high. You should never hold it below. If you hold your camera below looking up at you, I mean, you really aren't doing your face any justice. But these cell phones have very tiny sensors. They're extremely small. And the focal lengths tend to not to be very attractive as a result of all that. So what do you have? You have situations where the photos of a person's face generally don't look so good. When you hold a camera that close to their face and using the angles that are typical for making a selfie, you can distort how you look, and it's generally not attractive. In fact, they found out that your nose, by the typical length that you hold a camera from your face, typically, that distance, and using the focal lengths that are common in cell phone cameras, will make your nose look 30% bigger than it really is. And I'll guarantee you that 90% of the people out there don't know that. I mean, I have a friend who graduated from my small town high school, and he's a plastic surgeon, I think, out in California. And, people come in all the time, and they bring their cell phones in, and they tell them that they want their nose to look smaller. And he's got to tell them that, this is not a product of your nose being big. This is a product of your cell phone, distorting what your face looks like. And it's just, it's just sad. It's just really, really sad and unfortunate. But that's the way it is now. And it's unfortunate, but that's that's where we are in this world, and because of that, we've created these people that are, incredibly self-conscious and the whole nine yards, and it doesn't lend itself well, to their psychology or their psyche. I mean, who knows, what ramifications occur as a result of all this. Then there's one other problem that occurs as well. They found out too that people, because of the fact that because this process of making a photograph is gone, you're finding out that people aren't remembering the moment. When you go to an event, let's take a concert, an event that isn't very highly visual, and you take pictures, they're finding out that people forget the event. They forget the details, and they were wondering why. And it's because they're living their life through a viewfinder. Well, in a case of a cell phone, it would be through the LCD liquid crystal display on your cell phone, and they're living their life through that little box, and they're not seeing what's going on in the world around them, and they're not interacting. I mean, they're not part of the real world, and because of that, they're these interesting and fun events in their lives are gone. They're missing, and that's, I'm sorry, but that's not good either. So it's what I started questioning myself, about my own situation when I get to go out with what I do. I live in a pretty remote part of the country, but I get to experience some pretty remarkable things every year. I mean, you get to see, wild buffalo, stampede in front of you. You get to see, things like horsemen and cowboys and Indians and stuff doing things that, the average person just doesn't get a chance to see. And that's pretty remarkable. So I was worried that, I might somehow, some way, lose the memories of all these things, because, I mean, one of the reasons I got into photography wasn't so much to make photos. It was to, live a life and experience things that the average person just doesn't get a chance to see, or I wouldn't have a chance to see in my previous life. So I was kind of worried about that. But then I started realizing that, what I do, I kind of use a process. It's not the same process that they used, 20, 30 years ago when people were using analog film, but it's still a process. It's a process to make photographs. It's just because I'm a professional photographer, frankly, my process is more elaborate than the person who makes selfies with a cell phone. And maybe that's a tip to those who are using cell phones, that they should be a little more selective. I mean, there was a body of thought years ago, I haven't seen this said much lately, that you should only take 36 photographs every time you go out with your memory card, and you're going to make better photographs. And it's probably true, because back when you had only a roll of 36 exposures in your camera, you had to be a little more selective about what photographs you took. And so I wonder if maybe that's what we maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe we need to be a little more selective in the shots that we make, and maybe that's the same thing applies to the world of selfies. Maybe that applies to the world of taking pictures of what we eat for dinner at night. I mean, some things, frankly, your friends, I don't think, really want to know. Now, again, that could be a millennial thing. I don't know. Possibly is. I guess I don't get it. But I guess if it makes you happy, that's one thing. But you got to be looking at the bigger picture. I mean, would you rather be 70 years old and not have any experiences in life, or would you rather have a bunch of photographs that probably get lost the next time the power goes out, or you lose your memory card or your camera? I guess I don't understand. So that's a theory behind that. I'm getting soon done here, wrapping up what I'm trying to accomplish with this photograph. You guys aren't hearing me, are you? I'm gonna have to splice together everything I was talking about. I'm gonna have to pull in my photograph here. I'm sorry, I did something with my software that I should not have done. And so I apologize for that. I started wondering what some of the comments were going on in the side chat and why that was happening. But I apologize in advance, and we'll make sure that we get that spliced together in the final video. But I'll pull up these photographs. I'm going to talk about photographs that, and tell the story behind some of the photographs. And I'm pulling up one of the photographs now. This one here is, and I'm going to double check to make sure everybody can hear me. You are back. Okay. We're going to fix that for next week. I apologize to everyone. That was a snafu. Like I said, I'm still working out the kinks and all this. This is a photograph that I call early morning haul. Now, I have to tell you that I really think it's dorky that photographers and artists have to name photographs. But it's the nature of the beast. It's one of the hulkier jobs I have to do is like sit there and think for a couple of minutes and say, okay, what am I going to name this? Well, the reason you have names for photographs, I found out when I first got into photography, was that so customers could tell you the name of the photograph so they could license it or they could buy it for a print. So that's a reason you do that. I mean, if you just listed the file number, underscore 5D63219, I mean, that doesn't work. So I had to come up with a name for this photograph, and it was Early Morning Haul. And what happened leading up to this event, I had spent the 5 weeks prior to this photograph in Wisconsin because my mother had open heart surgery. And, we didn't know how it would go, but the thought was that, she'd be fine. But it would take 2 weeks, and by the nature of my job, I could go home and spend time with my folks for 2 weeks and do whatever. Well, as it turned out, they had a complication with the surgery. The anesthesiologist did something wrong, and it ended up being a 5 to 6 week ordeal. And so again, I could still conduct business back home, and that's what I did. But I hadn't really lifted a camera, in that whole time. So, when I was racing back to finally, when she was out of in the clear and everything was good, I was racing back to Wisconsin or back to Montana. And when I got there, the next day was 9/11, the 11th of September, which, for anybody old enough, they know the significance of 9/11. And I don't know what it is, but every 9/11 I go out and I just meander and I make photographs. I don't care what day it is. I have to get up early and just be by myself and go make photos. And, you don't know on some days if you're going to find something interesting to photograph or not. You don't know if you're going to make a great, memorable photograph or not. But for whatever reason, on 9/11, my entire life, I've managed to, since I've been a photographer, I've managed to capture some pretty compelling images. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's divine intervention, but it's always happened. And on this particular morning, I knew I was going to go photograph some farmers who are working in the fields near Shelby, Montana. The sun hadn't come up yet when I left my home. It was dark. I'd been on the road for about an hour. The sun started to come up, and I could look in my rearview mirror, and I saw the sky. And I knew the sky was going to be absolutely amazing. And when that happens, you're a photographer, you're like racing to find anything to put in the photograph with the sky. I was looking for a windmill. I was looking for a barn, anything at all. And of course, in eastern Montana, which is like the Great Plains, and it's just, relatively remote, finding something to photograph is easier said than done sometimes. But way out ahead, I saw this train. And, this is one reason this part of Montana is called the High Line. It's about 60 miles south of the Canadian border. And it's in reference to the railroad line, which used to be called the Great Northern Railway. And that's why they call this region the High Line. Well, I floored it. I was, my truck was going easily 100 miles an hour down the highway to catch up to this train. And I got out in front of it by about a mile or two. Well, more than that, but not much more than that. And I found a road finally that crossed these tracks. And I drove across the gravel road. I swung it around 360 degrees. And the entire process, I'm rolling down my window with my left hand, grabbing my camera with the right, and I'm thinking the whole time, what settings do I use? Because this isn't exactly an easy shot to get because it's still dark outside, right? And you gotta be careful because the meter on your camera might overexpose it or underexpose it because of the sky. And if I meter off the train, it might overexpose it because it's still kind of in the shadows. And then I got a train that's moving 60 miles an hour. So if my shutter speed isn't fast enough, the train will be blurry. So I got all these things going through my head. And I took like 3 shots. I had to steady my camera on the windshield. It was halfway down on my driver's side, aimed at it, and I got 3 shots. And I looked at the little tiny screen, LCD screen on the back of my camera, and you can't really tell if you nailed it, but I zoomed in. I'm like, I think I got it. And I went and got the rest of my photographs for the day, and I came back home and I edited this, and I was just amazed. I was happy as a lark. And this photograph now has been purchased, I can't tell you how many times, by the owners of the railroad, BNSF. They're out of Texas, and the guy I deal with is head of marketing, and he's out in Seattle. And, they purchased so many of these prints, large, like 40 inches by 30. It's like every time somebody retires from BNSF, this print ends up being a gift for them. And then they've licensed it several times for different promotions and even an ad. And so it's certainly one of my favorite shots because, any shot that makes you money and pays the bills is a good shot. But it also meant a lot because, it was right after my mom had her surgery and I was back to making photographs, and it was, I was back in my element. So that's the story behind that photograph. And the reason I'm doing these, I'm not sure if you caught the tail end of it. The reason I'm telling these stories is because, I think it's important to tell the story behind the shots sometimes, to tell other photographers, how I got the shot, but also to reiterate that, I try to still be in the moment when I'm capturing photographs, and I don't want to forget the stories behind my images. And so, I kind of want to share those stories as much as I can. This is a photograph of a cowboy, a real life cowboy, not the kind you find on a dude ranch. This is a lot of the cowboys you see in photographs today are models, or they're people that work on a dude ranch, which is like a quasi hotel for tourists to stay at. I don't like photographing. I don't photograph any of that stuff. All the cowboys and cowgirls you see in my photograph are 100% authentic. They are real American cowboys. They are ranchers. They live the cowboy life, and that's what I like to photograph because, frankly, their way of life is kind of going away. Horses are being replaced by four-wheelers. It's a requirement of every Western state that they brand their cattle, and instead of roping calves and cattle and giving a brand, they use something called a mechanical contraption called a branding table. And so that whole action that's been around for hundreds of years or 100 or more years is going away. Kids don't help out anymore on the ranch. And so it's just a way of life that's disappearing. So finding old-fashioned cowboys is a lot harder than you think it is. This gentleman's name is Tim Malsom. He's one of the nicest guys in the world. He's just super nice, and he has a wonderful family. He's got a wife who's probably every bit as good a horseman as he is. And he's got 3 or 4, maybe 4 now, young kids. And over the years, I've watched them grow up, and they make wonderful subjects for my photographs. And he's always, there for a smile and for a laugh, which, hi, Bookie, which is good and can be bad because, generally a photograph like this doesn't sell. I know I've used it in a couple of different magazines, but I haven't made a lot of money off of one of these. People have this image of a stern-faced cowboy, and so an image like this typically wouldn't sell. Well, on this particular day, they typically brand cattle in the West in the months of April and May. And, some days can be bitterly cold here in Montana, and some days can be awfully hot. On this particular day, it started out really nice. It was just a nice day. You didn't need a jacket. Everything was going great, but we knew that there was storms planned in the forecast. And so everybody was hurrying to get all the cattle branded on this particular day. And we saw the storm starting to roll in. And of course, I have a very expensive camera, very expensive lens. And so, if it looks like I'm standing outside in this sleet, it looks like rain, but it's really sleet that's coming down. It's ice and rain and snow that's falling. It was a weird storm, just crazy. And there was thunder and lightning. It was just a weird, weird situation. I wasn't outside. I was in my truck. As soon as the first raindrop hit, I made a beeline for my truck and I started driving around, the pasture, making photographs with my window down. And the storm had hit. It'd been only a minute or so, and Tim was on his horse. And of course, I whipped around, and these poor guys, they had only like 6 or 7 calves to brand yet, which, you can't brand cattle when it's raining because it would be inhumane, because the branding iron would never be able to burn through the hair to leave a branding mark because it's wet. And so they were just racing to get these last 6 calves done. And you could see he has a rope from his hand that leads out to where they're like untying a calf that he had just roped over here. And he saw me pull up, whip, because I saw him standing there. These guys are used to me by now. And I whipped my truck around and I had my window down and I stuck this big ass lens outside the window and just started snapping away. And Tim thought it was funny. So he just thought he'd crack a smile and he smiled and laughed as I was taking the shot. And when I got back home, the part I liked about the photograph wasn't so much Tim's expression, although that I knew that would make his family and everybody out in that neck of the woods, happy to see this photograph. It was just how this horse was just perfectly stoic. I mean, this horse, is getting pelted by all this, ice and stuff. And true to form, it just, I don't know if it was a he or a she, but the horse just, maintained its pose, even had perfect leg position for a photograph, and just stood there with its eyes open as I took the photograph. And so that was, I guess, the story behind that one, on that shot. Then my last one I'm going to go over is this one. This is one of the first photographs I made when I moved to the highline of Montana. And this is kind of a unique shot. And there's a good story behind this one too. This is in what was a place called Cottonwood, Montana. And there are a lot of these unincorporated ghost towns of sorts that litter the countryside throughout Montana. When they brought the trains out west, they had to load up on coal and water to make the steam engines work about every, I think it was 12 to 15 miles. And so you had these dinky little towns that popped up along the railroad tracks, and you'd have these, people out in the middle of nowhere were trying to scratch out and eke out an existence. Well, once World War II happened, a lot of the people out in the country moved back into the city to help out with the factories. And because of that, a lot of these towns started to disappear. And it's an unfortunate aspect of rural Montana, but it is what it is. And so, churches closed down, and buildings went away, and they sit out in the dry Montana air, and they just, start to fade away. And here's this church out in the middle. I mean, it is literally out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there isn't anything for miles around it, and it's just sitting there proudly. And again, it's another one of those things I like to photograph. Our churches, not because I'm particularly religious, although I am a Christian, not because they make money, because they don't. Nobody buys photographs of churches, especially old ones. Although I've sold this print a couple times, I think. The reason I do it is because, I guess I get a little melancholy about these churches, and there's lots of them out here that are just dying and rotting away on the plains of North Dakota and Montana and South Dakota and Wyoming and Idaho. And it's because, if you think about it, all the money was invested into the churches. I mean, that was the best built building in these communities. And they were more than just a place of worship. They were also a place where, children were christened, people were married, they voted for presidents of the United States in these facilities. They were also schools. I mean, every major event, reunions, every major community event in these towns occurred in these churches. And, that's, kind of sad for me, I guess, to see these buildings that might one day just be gone. And believe me, they are being torn down at a very rapid rate. They're not being protected. They're not on the national list of historical landmarks or anything like that. So I make a habit of go out and photographing them. Well, this particular photograph, I got permission from the landowner who happened to live in Colorado for some reason. And he said I could go out there and photograph it. Well, I drove into the pasture with my truck, closed the gate behind me. I didn't see anyone or anything. I set up my tripod, and I was going to have to stand there for a while to make these shots, because if you could see these streaking clouds, the way I was able to make the shot was I used a filter on my lens. It's commonly known in the world of photography as a big stopper. What it means is it's basically very dark. It's almost as dark as if you were to look through a welder's mask, that's how dark it is. It's almost black. And the reason that you use that is because it takes a broad sunlight day like this. This was a very sunny day, and it makes a super long exposure. You have to leave. In this particular case, this exposure was almost 17 minutes long for me to gather enough photons, enough light to make a well-exposed image. And what that does, it makes this cloud streak like you see here. And that's the beauty of it. And it makes wonderful black and white shots as a result of that, although this one I thought looked better in color. So I'm out here, I got my tripod, I'm near my truck, I got the camera up, I hit the button, and I sit there and I wait, and I tap my foot for like 17 minutes. And all of a sudden I heard something sniffing on my rear end, and I whipped around. I was like, because I got scared, I was startled. And they were like 6 big black Angus bulls staring me down in the middle of this pasture. And I was like, where the hell did they come from? Well, I grew up in a dairy farm, and you don't mess with bulls. You didn't cross a pasture on a dairy farm without your head on a swivel, because I knew lots of people who got gored by bulls. My brother damn near got killed twice by a bull. I was shoved through a fence by a bull. Literally shoved through a fence, a barbed wire fence by a bull. And I mean, people die by bulls. And I got scared, and I whipped around to the passenger side of my truck, opened up the door, tooted the horn, and they went running. And I said this to a rancher not long after this happened. And he says, son, you don't have to worry about black Angus bulls. They're very docile compared to dairy bulls. There's a big difference. And I guess I didn't know that, but still, it scared the hell out of me so much that I only got one exposure in, and this was it. Typically, I would probably try this. I did my math. I thought I knew how long the exposure needed to be, and I got it just right. But typically, I would take this shot maybe, 5, 6, 7 times just to make sure I got it right, and it just happened to work out right, and it ended up on this one. Actually did sell. It sold. It was on the cover of Montana Magazine, and it sold several times for a couple magazines, and I've sold a few prints on it. So I've actually made money on this particular one, but I can't say that's always the case. So that's the story of my 3 shots for this week. I'll go through 2 or 3 again next week, especially after I judge some of the feedback, and I'll probably add another feature to kind of keep these. And probably only do 1 or 2 photos next week, actually. I'm trying to keep these down to about 40, 45 minutes if I can, if that. So I guess if there's anybody in the side chat, anybody has any questions, if they want me to answer, if you have any photography questions, if you want to ask how I did something or why I did something, I'm happy to answer them. If you don't, then I will end the podcast and thank everybody for attending. I'll be back again next Wednesday, God willing, to do another podcast live. This one here will be posted live after about, probably takes about an hour. I'm going to have to go in and edit out the part where I was talking and nobody was listening. That'll take a little bit. But once I do that, I'll get it up. And so hopefully you'll enjoy watching it afterwards. Or if there's something in here you think somebody else might be interested in, be sure to send them over and ask them to like and subscribe. Otherwise, thanks everybody. If you ever have any questions that pop up afterwards, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. Otherwise, thank you very much, and everybody have a great day.
Sit, Ubu, sit. Good cow.